Okay, so you've sent over some sources on The World Is Not Enough, the 1999 Bond film with Pierce Brosnan. What is it about this one that makes it stand out? Why are we taking a deep dive into it?
Well, the retrospective from Joe Blow Originals on YouTube you sent over gives us a good perspective, It combines what people thought about the film back then, how well it did at the box office, and how critics see it now. And the thing that really sticks out is they tried to take Bond in a whole new direction.
Right. So for everyone listening, what we're going to do here is break down the core parts of The World Is Not Enough. We want to explore its whole journey from the initial ideas and production all the way to its release and its lasting impact on the entire Bond series.
And to really understand it, we need to remember what was going on in the film world back then. This film actually came out on the same day as Titanic.
Hmm.
Just imagine competing with a film that became such a massive cultural phenomenon. But, Pierce Brosnan's previous Bond film, Tomorrow Never Dies, that did really well.
Yeah, it did.
Made more money domestically than Goldeneye, although internationally it made slightly less back in 1997.
But there's a whole other story behind Tomorrow Never Dies, and that's where things get interesting. Apparently, it cost way more to make than Goldeneye, and the production was notoriously difficult. So going into The World Is Not Enough. There was this pressure, certain expectations.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems like Brosnan himself had a specific idea of where he wanted to take the character. He wanted to make Bond more serious, which I guess is why they decided to make The World Is Not Enough more of a serious spy thriller. And the main plot is about Bond protecting this woman named Elektra King. She inherits a huge oil empire, and he has to protect her from an assassin named Renard, played by Robert Carlyle.
Oh, yeah, Robert Carlyle. Great actor. And then there's this big twist. It turns out Electra's working with Renard. The idea was to create this Patty Hearst-style figure, like that heiress who got kidnapped and then seemingly joined her captors. The plan was to detonate plutonium and cause a nuclear meltdown in Istanbul. This would destroy a Russian oil pipeline, and that would skyrocket the value of Electra's oil holdings.
Yeah, that's a pretty bold plan.
It has been described as Goldfinger with oil and a female villain, which is a pretty cool concept, you know?
Yeah, for sure. And if we look at other Bond films, trying to create a really powerful and complex female villain like that was a pretty big step. I mean, usually the main villains have been men, right? So
Yeah,
this had the potential to be something really different.
absolutely. And to direct this more serious Bond film, Eon Pictures went with Michael Apted, a director mostly known for documentaries and smaller, character-driven dramas like Gorillas in the Mist. The retrospective points out that this decision really reflects how they were approaching production at the time. Efficiency was key. They wanted to release a Bond film every 2 years, which apparently took a toll on even someone like Brosnan.
Yeah, wow, that's a fast pace.
Right.
That focus on a tight schedule is really interesting. Apted himself was pretty honest with the studio. He admitted that he didn't have much experience with big action scenes. And they were just like, don't worry, our second unit crew who specialize in action, they'll handle all that. You can focus on the actors' performances.
Oh, I see.
But according to the retrospective, this dividing up of the work is a major problem with the film.
It does. The film often feels like they just stitched together these intense drama scenes with big action scenes that don't really connect to the story emotionally. It's almost like two different styles clashing, and it's wild that they considered Alphonse Cuarón to direct before they settled on Apted. I wonder what his version of Bond would have been like.
Right. That's a great what if. I mean, yeah, Cuarón hadn't directed some of his most visually amazing films yet, but he'd already gotten critical acclaim for films like Great Expectations and A Little Princess. Maybe he would have brought a more unique look or a different way of blending action and character.
Yeah.
But the source kind of suggests that the studio maybe wanted a director who was more established and maybe wouldn't be as visually experimental, and that's why they chose Apted.
Makes sense, I guess, if they wanted to maintain control and predictability in the franchise. Okay, so let's switch gears and talk about the script. The World Is Not Enough was the first Bond film where the screenplay was started by Neil Purvis and Robert Wade, who went on to become like the go-to writers for the series. Bruce Firestein also worked on the script.
The interesting thing is how the script developed. Apparently, after Apted came on board, he made some changes to what Purvis and Wade had written. Then his wife at the time, Dana Stevens, was brought in specifically to make the female roles stronger. It was a direct response to the criticism that Bond films often had weakly written female characters. It shows that they really wanted to make Elektra a strong and impactful character.
And they definitely found a powerful actress to play her. Casting Elektra was a big deal. They even considered Vera Farmiga. Eventually, they chose Sophie Marceau, who was already a huge star in France after Braveheart, and this meant paying her way more than they usually paid Bond girls.
Yeah. But it sounds like it was worth it. The retrospective is full of praise for Marceau's performance. They talk about her powerful presence and the amazing chemistry she had with Brosnan. She's widely considered one of the best actresses to ever play a Bond villain, and she made Elektra King a truly unforgettable character.
I agree. The source even says she's probably one of the best actresses we've ever had as a Bond girl. Although her role is way more than just a typical Bond girl, she's the mastermind behind it all.
Right.
But the casting wasn't all perfect. Robert Carlyle as Renard, that's a more controversial choice.
Oh, interesting.
The source often saw him as a glorified henchman, even though they tried to make him sympathetic by showing how the bullet wound was affecting him, making him stronger until he eventually died.
Yeah.
And, Javier Bardem apparently turned down that role.
Oh, wow. That would have been interesting to see.
Right. Carlyle's a fantastic actor, super intense. But maybe the script didn't fully explore Renard's motives or give him enough agency to really be seen as the main threat, like Elektra.
Right.
The whole story seems to revolve around her manipulation and her grand plan.
Yeah.
And then there's Denise Richards as Dr. Christmas Jones.
Ah, yes.
This is still a big point of, well, let's just say discussion. Richards was a global superstar back then, after films like Starship Troopers and Wild Thing. But her performance as a nuclear physicist, well, most people think it wasn't believable and kind of cartoonish.
Yeah, it was a bit of a strange casting choice.
It was.
The retrospective doesn't hold back. They say her performance craters the film for a lot of viewers. And it seems like they cast her because she was so famous, not because she was right for the part.
It's a good example of the struggle between casting for marketability and casting for authenticity to the character. And in this case, it probably made the film less believable for many people.
It definitely did.
It's interesting to compare how audiences and critics reacted to the film back then versus now. Initially, a lot of Bond fans liked it. They thought it had a more complex plot than Tomorrow Never Dies. But looking back, the retrospective suggests it doesn't really hold up well when you watch it again. It feels kind of disjointed, slow between the action scenes, which, except for the opening boat chase, are pretty standard. The reviewer even shared a story about how he started to dislike the film more and more while he was reviewing the Blu-ray subtitles, like doing quality control.
Oh, wow.
Which I think says a lot.
It really shows that the initial excitement, the spectacle of a big-budget film, can sometimes mask problems with the story or characters, problems that you only notice when you watch it again.
For me, it shows that even though big action and a strong female villain can initially draw an audience in, if the story isn't cohesive and believable, the film might not be as satisfying in the long run. Now let's talk about Pierce Brosnan's performance in all this. The source says that Brosnan seems genuinely engaged, especially in his scenes with Sophie Marceau. They say he conveys a real emotional connection.
Right. Like there's real chemistry there.
Yeah, totally.
That's a really important observation. It suggests that Brosnan was capable of delivering a more emotionally impactful performance as Bond. But the ending of the film kind of ruins it. Bond's cheesy line to Christmas Jones, I thought Christmas only comes once a year. It just feels so out of place, especially after the serious and emotionally complex relationship he had with Elektra.
I totally agree. The source compares it to the Daniel Craig era, where the films often end with Bond showing the emotional toll of everything he's gone through. The joke at the end of The World Is Not Enough just feels like a step backwards, like they're going back to a more simplistic and unemotional portrayal of Bond. And it really lessens the impact of Elektra's death. They give Brosnan's overall performance a 7 out of 10. But they also say that he could have been one of the best Bonds if he had had better material to work with.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Even a really talented actor can only do so much if the script and the overall story aren't that strong.
Exactly. Okay, back to the villains. Sophie Marceau as Elektra King is widely seen as one of the best, maybe even the best Bond villain ever.
Yeah, she's fantastic.
But the film sort of messes up by shifting the focus back to Renard towards the end. This has led to debates among fans about who the real main villain is.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
The source itself questions whether Elektra was actually the mastermind the whole time, or if they just felt like they had to have the male villain be the final threat because that's the traditional Bond formula. And this kind of ambiguity weakens both characters, I think. Overall, the villains get a 7 out of 10, mainly because of Marceau's amazing performance.
Right. Now let's talk about the music. David Arnold's score is generally praised for its more relaxed, John Barry-esque style. And the Garbage theme song is considered one of the best Bond themes from that era.
Absolutely. And this film also introduced John Cleese as R, who was supposed to be the successor, not a replacement, to Desmond Llewellyn as Q. It was a way to keep that iconic dynamic going.
But a lot of people see Cleese's version of Q as more comedic and less subtle, lacking the charm and unique chemistry Llewellyn had with Bond. The source points out that bittersweet scene where Q hints at retirement and gives Bond that crucial advice. Never let them see you bleed and always have an escape plan.
Yeah, it's a really touching scene. And it's even more meaningful because Desmond Llewellyn died in a car accident just after the film came out. This was his last film as Q.
Oh, wow.
It makes that goodbye scene even more powerful, especially for fans who grew up watching him play Q.
It really does. And while Q's farewell was handled well, the introduction of R just didn't quite have the same magic for a lot of viewers.
Right. Now, as for the action scenes in The World Is Not Enough, there are definitely some big, spectacular ones, but most of them are seen as pretty standard. Well done, but nothing particularly memorable.
Yeah, agreed.
The one exception is that opening boat chase. The source calls it one of the film's most dynamic and exciting moments. And it's the longest pre-credits sequence in any Bond film. It's interesting that they originally planned to put it after the opening credits and theme song.
Oh, wow.
That would have made the start of the film a lot less impactful.
Definitely. Moving the boat chase to the beginning was a smart move. It gives you that classic Bond action and excitement right away.
Yeah.
But the film struggles to keep that energy and inventiveness going throughout.
So when we look at the big picture, The World Is Not Enough has its flaws. And the retrospective reviewer wasn't that impressed. He gave it a 5 out of 10, and he said it's one of his least favorite Bond films.
Yeah, I get that.
But despite all that, it was a huge box office success. It made $126 million domestically, even more than Tomorrow Never Dies, and a total of $362 million worldwide, which was a new record for the franchise at the time.
That's crazy.
You know, right?
Really shows you how different critical opinion and commercial success can be.
It does.
It's clear that people still loved Pierce Brosnan as Bond, and the classic Bond formula was still a big draw, even if the film had some problems.
Absolutely.
And maybe this foreshadowed some of the challenges the Brosnan era would face, ultimately leading to that very controversial film Die Another Day.
Okay, so hopefully you have a much better understanding of The World Is Not Enough now. We talked about how it tried to be more serious, the effects of the director and writing choices, Sophie Marceau's brilliant performance as the villain Elektra King, the controversy around Denise Richards being cast as Dr. Christmas Jones, that sad farewell to Desmond Llewellyn's Q, and how the film's legacy is mixed, even though it was a box office hit.
Hopefully, this deep dive has given you the info you were looking for and showed you some of the surprising things about the film.
Yeah.
We wanted to give you a more nuanced view of this particular Bond film.
Exactly.
It's a great example of how even very successful films in a franchise can have complicated aspects that people debate about.
Absolutely. So, if you think about the studio wanting to make the films efficiently and keep control, and then you look at the different ways audiences and critics reacted to The World Is Not Enough, what does that tell us about how hard it is to keep a long-running, popular franchise like James Bond going? And how do those behind-the-scenes pressures and creative compromises affect what we actually see on screen? That's definitely something to think about when considering the legacy of 007.
Absolutely.
Okay, great discussion. Until next time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.